Turn your Bibles to the book of Ruth, chapter 3. It's a 4-chapter book, so it'll be 4 lessons. So we're not spending 2 years on the book of Ruth. Anyway, okay. We have some lesson sheets. Please have, if you need one, raise your hand. Help you follow along. We always like to do a little quick review because we don't know who was here last time and who wasn't, and it kind of helps you know what's going on to kind of get a little background. So the book of Ruth was written 1,100 years before Christ, written by the prophet and judge and priest Samuel. Happened during the time of the judges in Israel before the kings. And so when we started chapter 1, there had been a famine in Israel. And so it was either starve or move. And so a man named Elimelech and his family, his wife Naomi and 2 sons, Chalon and Malion, go to Moab. So that is, if you, I'd shown you some maps the last couple of times, but basically you go to the east side of the Jordan and then go south along the Dead Sea, and that's the land of Moab. And it was a much more fertile area, so they had food there. So they went there so they would not starve to death. Moab got its, ancestry from Lot. So 1,000 years before this story occurred, you remember back in Genesis, Abraham and Lot had both had lots and lots of herds and flocks, and Abram said to Lot, you know, this land that we're in, this land of Canaan, can't support both of us, so you go one way, I'll go the other, you choose which way you want to go. And so Lot said, I'll go to the east of Jordan, because he knew that was, as Genesis said, a much more fertile land. So Lot chose the more fertile land, and that then one of Lot's descendants was Moab, and so that became the Moabites. And so that's kind of where the origination of the Moabite nation came from. Anyway, so Elimelech and his family were there in chapter 1 in Moab, and he dies. So leaving Naomi with the 2 sons, the 2 of the sons apparently are older teens or young men, because at some point they get married. They get married to Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then tragedy strikes again. The 2 sons die. So now we have 3 widows. Naomi, the wife of Elimelech, Orpah, and Ruth. Then Naomi hears that the famine in Israel is over and decides to go back to her home in Bethlehem, and tells Orpah and Ruth to stay because they're young, they're Moabite, it's their land, their lineage, their life. Why not just stay here and y'all can get married to somebody else? And so Orpah decides to go back, but Ruth says, I am not leaving you, Naomi. So she clings to Naomi. And the famous verses in Ruth 1:16-17, Ruth declares that she is going to stay with Naomi and go back to Bethlehem. Very, very remarkable couple of verses you hear in a lot of wedding ceremonies because it's such a statement of commitment. Ruth says, first she says, I'm committing to a new land. She says, where you go, I will go. So she's forsaking Moab as her land. And then she commits to a new life. She says, where you live, I will live. So she's forsaking her life in Moab. And then she commits to a new lineage or heritage. She says, your people will be my people. So she's forsaking her Moabite heritage. And then she says, I'm committing to a new Lord. Your God will be my God. So she's forsaking the Moabite God who was Chemosh. And then Ruth finishes that amazing declaration by kind of sealing it with a burning the bridge comment. She says, where you die, I will die. In other words, I am not going back to my old life. So Ruth and Naomi go back to Bethlehem, and we get to chapter 2. And so in chapter 2, we find that Ruth and Naomi are in Bethlehem. They're penniless widows. And so, you know, they have to beg, they have no means of support. There's no man to support them. And so I'm sure that Naomi tells Ruth about the God's commandment, to the Israelites back in Leviticus about gleaning the fields. And so The gleaners are the people who go into the fields. These are the poor and the foreigners who live in Israel. God provided a way for them to have something to eat. He instructed the Israelites that when they harvested their fields, to not harvest the edges of the field, and if they're in the middle of the field, if they're harvesting and they drop something, they drop some grain or grapes or whatever it is they're harvesting, to not pick it up, to leave it for the gleaners. And so Ruth, to support herself and Naomi, becomes a gleaner. So we kind of get the idea that Naomi is older and maybe disabled to some degree because she's not gleaning herself. And so a critical verse in chapter 2 was verse 3, and I really like this word. Ruth happened to glean in the field of Boaz. And we talked about how that word happened is the only time it's used in the Old Testament, but it's a Hebrew word that means to happen by destiny or to step into destiny. So through God's leading, because Ruth had given herself over to God, God led her to step into her destiny. So it wasn't something that happened by chance. It wasn't that she had heard of Boaz as this great wealthy man that was a man of great honor, so she wanted to kind of get close to him. This was a totally God thing, as we would say. And that step changes the course of history. And then back in verse 1 of that chapter, Naomi had referred to Boaz as a worthy man. And we looked at the origin of that word. And that word is most often translated in the Old Testament as army. 51 times it's translated as army. So he was a man of valor, a man of character, a man of strength, and a man of means. So Ruth steps into destiny on the land of Boaz, and then Boaz hears from his chief worker what a hard worker Ruth is, and also how she has been so good to her mother-in-law Naomi, and has come from Moab. And so Boaz learns about Ruth through his chief worker. Anyway, so Boaz is kind to Ruth. He actually kind of provides extra gleanings for her, has her eat with he and the workers at lunchtime, and then sends her home with extra things. And so she comes home that first day of gleaning from Boaz's field, and Naomi says, "Where in the world have you been, girl? You have done good today." Because she's brought home so much. She brought home a big bushel basket of grain. Anyway, so what we learned from that was that when Ruth, who had given herself to God, and we have Boaz, who's a man of God, both of them were being used by God to step into their destiny. And we referenced the verse in Psalm 37:23 that the steps of a man are ordered by the Lord when he delights in his way. And so the big lesson last time was that when we commit our way to the Lord, he will order our steps. And we don't always understand why we're doing certain things. We don't always see the end of it. But he's not ordering our steps for our purposes. He's ordering our steps for his purposes so that we are the instrument in his hands. I thought, as I was kind of reviewing this, I thought of something I didn't think about last time, and that was, you probably heard the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. And he says, "Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace." You know, you've heard that before? And I was thinking about that. You know, years ago when I was in high school, I played in the band. And so, I have the instrument, but the instrument made music that I wanted it to make. It wasn't making its own music. The purpose of the instrument was not to do its own thing. It was simply to help me make the music that I wanted to make. And so when we become committed to God and he orders our steps, we are instruments of his to make the music that he wants to make on this earth. And so it's not all about us. It's not about us at all. We are simply instruments in his hand. We are the clay in the potter's hand. We're the instruments in his hand. He is ordering our steps if we commit our will to his will. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with chapter 3 there. That's kind of bring you up to where we are. One of the commentators I read label these chapters. I thought it was interesting. The first one he labeled weeping, because remember Ruth and her two daughters-in-law all lost their husbands, so the first chapter was weeping. He labeled the second chapter working, because that's where Ruth gets out in the field and does the gleaning and the working. And then he labels chapter 3 the waiting. And then the fourth one he labels the wedding and the worship. So, we like, as speakers, you always like things that are kind of all start with the same letter. So weeping, working, waiting, wedding, and worship. So that's the book of Ruth in 5 words. Okay, so let's start with verse 1 of chapter 3 and see what we can learn from chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" And so Naomi says, "I'm seeking rest for you." So what that means is I'm seeking security for you. Basically, you're getting out there and you're working every day, you're gleaning. When the harvest is not there, you're going to have to be begging. This is not really what you need for your life. You need some security. And in that culture, security for a woman meant marriage. Nowadays it's not necessarily so. We have a lot of women in the workplace that provide for themselves. But in that culture, women didn't do that. It was very, very rare for a woman to be, have a substantial income from work. And so basically Naomi is saying to Ruth, it's time to find you a husband. That's what she's saying in so many words. So apparently Naomi has resolved that, she's going to remain a widow. She's probably older. She's probably disabled. And so she really has no realistic hope of marrying again. But she doesn't want Ruth, who's much younger, but also she's a foreigner in the land, to believe that she has to stay a widow and stay a gleaner and a beggar. So Ruth casts this vision. Naomi casts this vision to Ruth. In other words, Ruth, here's my strategy. Here's my vision for you. Let's think about vision. Let's get a future for you. So let's see what the vision is. Verse 2 through 5. "Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." Okay, so do we have a picture of a threshing floor? I don't know who's up in there in the eagle's nest. There we go. Okay, so this is a depiction of an ancient threshing floor. So after grain was cut, it was brought to the threshing floor, and so the threshing floor was tend to put on the top of a hill or a mountain because that's where there was greater wind. And so first they would lay the grain and the threshing floor was like a stone floor, and so they would lay the cut grain across the floor, and then either oxen or people would trample on the grain to separate the grain from the stems, the wheat stems or the barley stems. So once that had been trampled, which is threshed, then they would rake up the stems, which would leave the grain on the floor. And then typically I read that in the evening the winds would be greater, so then the men would be on the threshing floor with the grain that had been raked up, and they would throw the grain into the air, and that was what was called winnowing. They would winnow the grain. So after it had been stomped on, they would throw the grain in the air, and the wind would blow the chaff, the coverings of the grain, the husks away, and then the grain would fall back to the floor. So they would do this over and over until all the chaff was blown away. So threshing was stomping on it, and winnowing it was throwing it up in the air. So at the end of the harvest, all the grain is taken to the threshing floor. And of course, the owner is concerned about, that's his crop that crop for the year, and so he has to protect it. So he stays there at night time to protect from theft. But that's what's going on. So Ruth is going to this threshing floor. And Naomi knew that Boaz would be there. So she tells her 3 things. She says, clean up, smell up, dress up. She says, take a bath, put some perfume on, put your nice dress on. Now, the only other time these three instructions are given in the Bible is in Ezekiel 16, and it's instructions in preparation for marriage. So Naomi is giving her a vision of getting ready to get married. Now, we're blessed with indoor plumbing. We take a lot of baths and showers. Back then they didn't have indoor plumbing. And so, I look back to see, how often did people that age take baths? And the farthest I could see back was in Rome, where they had public baths, because they didn't have individual baths in houses. The commoners were allowed to come every 9 days and take a bath. Of course, the wealthy people had baths in their homes, and they could take baths as often as they wanted to, but at least ancient Rome, which is 1,000 years after this story here. So back in these days of these peasants, most likely what we would call a bucket bath. Unless there was a stream or a river nearby that they could go get in, then basically it was go to the well where the water was and get your bucket of water, take it to your house, and get a washcloth or a rag and do the best you can to bathe yourself. So that's kind of what that was. And then thinking about clothes, again, we're blessed again. I mean, you can walk in your closet. I bet you anyone in here could walk in your closet and wear something different for 2 or 3 weeks and never have to wear something twice, because we have so many clothes. And I'd never thought about that until I was in college, and I had a Nigerian student that was sitting next to me in one of my classes. And he and I got talking and befriended him, now Nigeria used to be a British colony, and so they drink tea, they didn't drink coffee. And so he invited me to his dorm room to drink tea, come have tea with me and visit so we can get to know each other. And going, now this is before microwaves. He had a hot plate, okay? Mike and I know about these days. Anyway, hot plate, and anyway, so I come to his dorm room, and he doesn't have anybody else in the dorm. He's in the dorm room by himself. He doesn't have a dorm room partner. And the dorm rooms we had at the college, you walk in, and just to the left is the closet, the door of the closet, and then there's the room. I'll never forget walking in there, because in the dorm closets we had, they were made for 2 people, and on one side you'd have a lower rack about 6 feet, 8 feet long, and an upper rack about 6 feet, 8 feet long, and then a shelf on top of each rack. And so each person had one side. So there were enough, you could have 2 6 or 8 foot rods of clothes. I'll never forget walking in his room, looking in his closet. There's one shirt, one pair of pants hanging there. And he had on a shirt and a pair of pants. All the clothes to his name were 2 shirts, 2 pair of pants. And here we have so much clothes, we don't know what to do with it all. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, you go back in history, and unless you were a very, very wealthy person or royalty, you had very few clothes. And so I'm imagining that Ruth had 2 sets of clothes, a work clothes and then a synagogue clothes. That's what I'm guessing. Anyway, so she's supposed to put on her nice clothes. So she takes a bath, however she can do that, puts some perfume on, puts her nice clothes on, and then Naomi says, don't announce, kind of sneak up to the threshing floor when it's getting dark, and don't let him see you're there. And then when it gets dark, after he eats and drinks and lays down and goes to sleep, go lay at his feet and just wait. And so Ruth says, I'll do that. So, Naomi knows that Boaz is a man of honor, a man of God, and he knows that he's not going to take advantage of Ruth at all. Okay, let's see what happens at verse 6 through 9. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly, tiptoed, and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. So Ruth does exactly what Naomi tells her to do. Boaz is finishing his work. It's late. He's eating. He's drinking. He's laying down. He's going to sleep. And Ruth, once he's asleep, sneaks over to where he is, uncovers his feet, and lays down. And I doubt that she goes to sleep. You know, she's very anxious. I mean, we know the rest of the story. She doesn't. You know, she's in the middle of this thing and doesn't really know how it's going to turn out. So I imagine her heart's beating out of her chest. You know, is he going to accept my proposal or not? Anyway, so, you know, back when we did the Red Letter series, we kind of talked about how when you look at Scripture, not only is context and consistency important in interpreting, but also cultural background. So I kind of looked at the cultural background of what Ruth is doing here. And even today in the primitive Middle Eastern cultures, it's not unusual for a servant to sleep crosswise at the feet of their master and to use some of the master's covering for themselves. And so this is what Ruth is doing, that Ruth is assuming the position of a servant. She's not assuming the position of a seductress. She's assuming the position of a servant. So Boaz is eating and drinking, and that his heart was merry, the Bible says, and he wakes up at midnight. He's startled to find Ruth at his feet. This is, I think I've told you before, I head up the sleep clinic at the hospital and visiting with people about their insomnia issues. You know, what we know is in America, alcohol is the number one sleeping medicine that's used in America. And the reason it's done is because alcohol is a nervous system depressant. So it makes you sleepy. So a lot of people that can't sleep well will drink alcohol right before bedtime so they can get to sleep. But what we also know about it is once you get to sleep, it interrupts your sleep cycles. It particularly decreases what's called REM, R-E-M sleep, which is your restful sleep cycle. And a lot of people that drink alcohol at bedtime find themselves waking up in the middle of the night for no reason because the alcohol has actually messed up their sleep cycle. So it's really a very poor drug for sleep. So you see, that's kind of what happened to Boaz here. He kind of wakes up startled in the middle of the night, and lo and behold, there's a woman down there on his feet. So he is very startled, and he says, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant." So again, remember, she's laying crosswise at his feet. "I am Ruth, your servant." She's assumed the position of a servant. And she says, "You are a redeemer." And so she's saying, you are a person by God's law who is appointed to be a kinsman redeemer to my family. And the Strong's word here is Gaal, G-A-A-L, and it's a Hebrew word that is translated either kinsman, redeemer, or both, over and over. Actually about 7 times in the book of Ruth. Now, next lesson, when we study chapter 4, we're going to go into that a whole lot more, so I'm not going to speak much about that right now, but that's going to be the thrust of our chapter 4. Anyway, but basically, concisely, a kinsman redeemer under Jewish law was a person who, by nature of kinship, had the opportunity, he didn't have to, he had the opportunity to redeem. To redeem means to buy back. So he could redeem a relative's land that had been sold due to debt, or he could redeem a relative who was in actual or potential slavery. Now, I think we mentioned before that it's not really stated in the book of Ruth, but we assume that the reason Elimelech probably had to leave with Naomi and his 2 sons was the famine had come, and this was an agricultural society, so he probably had been in debt and had to sell his land, so he had no way to make a living, so he moved to Moab to work on somebody's farm, is probably what happened. And so when Naomi comes back, Elimelech's land, her family land, belongs to somebody else. Now, if you look at the Jewish law, every 50 years, the year of Jubilee, it returned to the original family, but this is obviously not during that time. So Jubilee hadn't occurred. So Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, and like I say, we've assumed that Naomi is unable to work, and so Ruth is gleaning the field, but now the harvest is over. It says the harvest is over when the chapter started there. And so Ruth is left to beg, and she's basically faced with starvation. She and Naomi are faced with starvation. And so here's a situation where Ruth is kind of saying, Boaz, I need to be redeemed. I'm of your family because I'm a widow of a man that was in your family. And so potentially I could be sold into slavery. I could sell myself into slavery, which they could do if they face starvation. So if you're Ruth, you kind of put this out there, and then let's kind of put ourselves in Ruth's mind. What is she thinking? What's he going to say? What's this guy going to say? This powerful, worthy, rich man, what's he going to say? And obviously, we're going to find out he's an older man. But Ruth is thinking, would this strong, wealthy, highly respected Israelite, stretch his robe over me, a poor foreigner, a Moabite widow, a newcomer, no credibility, no credentials. I don't really have anything to offer him. I just kind of showed up on the scene. Why would this guy do this for me? And you see, that's kind of the same question that a lot of people have when they come to God. Magnificent, creator of the world God, why would God save me? Why would God redeem me? That's the same question Ruth's asking herself. Why would Boaz redeem me? I have nothing to offer. I have no credentials. I'm really, I've come from the far country. And so a lot of us kind of look at God that way. Now, why would he redeem me? So that's the thinking that Ruth was having as she was waiting for Boaz's answer. So let's see what he answers there in verse 10. And Boaz said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." So he talks about a first and a last kindness. So first of all, he addresses her as my daughter. So that's what makes us believe that he is an older man, and we don't know if he's a widow himself. We don't know if he's never been married. But apparently he's an older man because he addresses her as my daughter. And then he says, your last kindness is greater than the first. Well, the first kindness, we can refer back to what he talked to her in chapter 2, in verse 11, when he talks to her about how amazed he is, how she has come from Moab to be with Naomi, to take care of Naomi, and she's left her own homeland. She's left her opportunity to marry someone of her own race, of her own religion, of her own lineage, to take care of Naomi. And so here's a woman who's given up her self-interest for the interest of somebody else. That was her first kindness. And now he says, your last kindness is greater than the first. So what's that last kindness? And so basically he's saying, Ruth, you are willing to be redeemed and marry an older man, not for your sake, but because if you went off and you could be married to some young Israelite, that's not a redeemer. Just go marry somebody, and she could do that. But where would that leave Naomi? Naomi would be a penniless, poor widow with no means of support. But he's saying, Ruth, you have chosen to come here and basically propose to me in the way this law went. Marry me, an older man. I'm not your young stud. I'm the older guy. But you've done this because you want to take care of Naomi. He said, you're giving up your entire life because you care about somebody else. Isn't that amazing? So she's ensuring, by doing this, Ruth is ensuring Naomi's welfare. Certainly she's ensuring her own also. But her concern was more about Naomi because she could have ensured her own welfare by marrying somebody else. But by getting Boaz to marry her, she was ensuring Naomi's welfare. So Boaz is saying, you're willing to give up your own self-interest so that by following God's law, Naomi will be blessed and taken care of. And then he keeps talking, verse 11 through 13. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you're a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. So lie down until the morning. So we see here that Boaz uses the same powerful word to describe Ruth that Naomi used to describe Boaz. This word worthy is this same word that basically most of the time in the Old Testament is translated army. In other words, a person that's just a force of nature. And so I went to my Strong's. I thought, well, let's see where else it's used. And you may remember Solomon's description of this incredible woman in Proverbs 31. Remember that? This woman that she's kind of the all-everything woman. I mean, she can do anything. She's everything to everybody. And this word is used for her. Solomon uses the same word for her, that she's an army of one. She's a worthy, virtuous woman that's just incredible. And so that's the kind of word that Boaz uses here to describe Ruth. Okay, and then in verse 12 and 13, he said, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to be your redeemer, redeem you, redeem Naomi, redeem your land. He said, but by law, there's somebody that's a closer kin than me. And so by the Jewish law, there was a pecking order, so to speak. In other words, the closer the relative, that relative had, as we would call it, right of first refusal. If they were asked to redeem, then they had to go in order of closeness of relation. And so Boaz says, there's one person closer than me. He has to be asked first. If he redeems you, great. If he doesn't, I will do it. We'll find out tomorrow. So just lay down and try to sleep if you can. Anyway, so that was Boaz's answer. Okay, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you're wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. So it starts out saying she lay at his feet till morning. I thought about that. Where's the best place for each of us to start the day? At the foot of the Savior, right? Absolutely. Anyway, so the harvest is over, so there's no more fields to glean. All the harvest is at the threshing floors. So Ruth has been bringing home food to Naomi from gleaning, but there's no more fields to glean. So Boaz is going to provide something for Ruth and Naomi by giving her 6 measures of barley. Something Pastor Mike's taught me that there's so much meaning in not just words, but also in numbers in the Bible. So I was reading several commentators about what they thought about this 6 measures. And one fellow said it represented the 6 great men of God that would come through Ruth's lineage. Now, the Jews kept extremely good records of their lineages. So I wasn't aware of all this, but this is what this fellow said. This was Adam Clark. He said, of course, we know about King David. Then he said Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then, of course, Jesus. But that's 6. And so maybe that represented the 6. But I think the one I really agree with more, was that Boaz was sending Naomi a message. And see, Ruth is new to the Jewish faith, so she hasn't been steeped in all of their the teachings and all the lessons and everything. But there's a meaning to this 6. Remember, God worked 6 days, and he didn't rest until his work was finished. Remember? And so I think Boaz is sending a message to Naomi. When Ruth comes home with 6 measures of barley, he's trying to tell Naomi, I'm going to work until the work is finished, then I'll rest. And when we read to the next verse, you'll see that Naomi got that exact message. So verse 16 through 18. So I believe this is on the back of your lesson sheet. And when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi said, "How'd you fare, my daughter?" You know, they had this acting out the vision work. Then Ruth told her all that the man had done for her, saying, These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Naomi replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out." Here it is. "For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And so the little secret message, Naomi, I'm not going to rest until the work is done. And so that's exactly what happens. So that's kind of the end of chapter 3. We'll get into chapter 4 next time. So as we complete this lesson, and I got to thinking about the 2 Naomis that we've seen so far. The Naomi at the end of chapter 1, after she had lost her husband and 2 sons, and here we have this totally different Naomi here in chapter 3. And you know what's happened to her from chapter 1 to chapter 3? Well, her circumstances are really pretty much the same. She's still a penniless, poor widow, depending on gleanings and beggings that Ruth was doing. But in chapter 1, remember when she comes back into Bethlehem with Naomi, her old town, her old friends, she hadn't been there in at least 10 years or so, and you know they're excited to see her, but they don't hardly recognize her because she looks so bad. You know, she's aged much more than the 10 years, and I think she looks so unhappy and so sad. And remember, she tells them, "Don't call me Naomi." Now, that's my name, but don't call me that. And that name means pleasant. But she says, "Call me Mara." And we know that word means bitter. So she was a very bitter person when she shows up in Bethlehem. She had lost her husband, she had lost both of her sons, and she blamed God. She says, "I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty." So that's the Naomi of chapter 1. And then we come to chapter 3, and we see this Naomi that's full of hope. We see this Naomi that has a vision, that thinks there's a future. And so Naomi develops this vision, this dream, and passes this dream and this vision on to Ruth to take the action. And still, Naomi is still this really insignificant person in the history of Israel. And yet, because she casts this vision, brings Ruth to action, she changes the course of history. Because Ruth, this poor Moabite widow, becomes the grandmother of King David. And she is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. All because Naomi cast this vision. So I was going to end up the lesson. I wanted to kind of, there's several websites where you can go for quotes. So I like quotes. So I started looking at quotes about visions and dreams. But I'm also kind of funny because anybody can say anything. So when I find good quotes, I like to see, let's just take a little look at their life and see if their life had something to do with that or were they just talking. You know, anybody can just talk, right? So you call that context. So you kind of look at the context of the quote. So I came across this great quote by T.E. Lawrence. Can you put that up there? Okay. Here's the quote. "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity." In other words, your nighttime, when you're asleep and you're dreaming, that's just dream. That doesn't mean anything. "But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. This I did." So I thought, wow, that's pretty powerful. Let's see who is this guy anyway? Well, let me tell you a story. I really didn't know this story before. T.E. Lawrence was a British Army captain. Not a general, not a colonel, not a major. He was a captain, an important officer, but certainly not tip-top guy. He was a British Army captain. He was in the intelligence service of the British Army in World War I. He was stationed in Cairo, Egypt. And so this is the situation. World War I is breaking out. You know, there's the Allied forces and what's called the Axis forces. You know, the United States and Britain, France, you know, they were the Allied forces. Germany, and several other nations in Eastern Europe were the Axis forces. And so the war had broken out. Well, the Ottoman Empire, and I don't remember studying this much in world history, but the Ottoman Empire was still going strong at that time. The Ottoman Empire was one of the largest, oldest empires in the history of the world. At that time, it was 700 years old. You know, I don't know exact world history, but that's longer than the Roman Empire, that's longer than the Grecian Empire. I think the Egyptian Empire back in the Bible times was probably the only one that lasted more than 700 years. Now let me tell you the land they controlled for 700 years. Okay? It was based in Turkey, what was modern-day Turkey. Then you go up into southeastern Europe, you talk about Greece and the lands just above Greece. You come down into what we call Israel and those Arab lands there. And then you go east to Iraq and Iran. And then you come down to what we call Saudi Arabia. And then you come down to Egypt. And then you cross over all of North Africa. That was the Ottoman Empire for 700 years. And it was still going strong in 1916. So what happens is at the beginning of the war, the Ottoman Empire decides to align with the Axis powers. This is like the 800-pound gorilla joining the other side. This is like you're playing pickup basketball and Michael Jordan says, I want to be on the other team. The fear in the Allied forces was serious. Their freedom was being threatened. T.E. Lawrence, a captain in the British Army in Cairo, in the intelligence service, had a vision. He had a dream. He had an idea. He went to his superior officer and he said, let me try this. If the Ottomans are with the Axis powers, we can't win this war. I've got an idea. So he talked about his idea with his superior, and the superior said, it's worth a try. He got permission from his superior to go to Mecca. Mecca is the holiest of the Muslim cities, of the Arab cities. It's in what we call Saudi Arabia today. T.E. Lawrence went to Mecca and got an audience with the Sheikh of Mecca, who is the top dog Muslim. He got an audience with him. And he sat down with him and he cast a vision. He said, you and all your Arab peoples have loathed being under the Ottomans for 700 years. I have word from my superiors that if you will revolt against the Ottomans, we will support you. Because the British knew if the Ottomans didn't help the Axis powers, they could defeat the Axis powers. So T.E. Lawrence goes to the Sheikh of Mecca, casts the vision with him. The Sheikh buys into the vision, calls all of his Arab leaders across what we now know as Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Northern Africa, and this is the beginning of what is called in world history as the Arab Revolt. And so the Ottomans never got to join into the World War I because they were fighting the people in their own country, the Arabs, who were seeking independence. So it became a war of independence. And T.E. Lawrence rode a camel and dressed as an Arab and fought with them. And the Arabs won. And that's the beginning of what we know as the Arab nations today. That's where they all came from. They were all divided up after that. And T.E. Lawrence today is called Lawrence of Arabia. And as Paul Harvey would say, that's the rest of the story. Anyway, there was a movie made about him in 1962 by Peter O'Toole. That's right, yeah. Anyway, so there's another, he wrote a book after the war. Put the next quote up. Well, okay, there we go. So he writes his memoirs after the war in a book, and he calls it, the book is called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a Triumph. He wrote it in 1919. It was actually published in 1926. He gets the name of the book from Proverbs 9:1. Wisdom has built her house. She has carved its 7 pillars. So he's talking about freedom here. He was so afraid of losing his freedom and the British people losing their freedom that he cast this vision. So he's saying, I love you, talking about freedom. I loved you, freedom. So I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky and the stars to earn you, freedom, the 7-pillared worthy house, that your eyes might be shining for me when we came. So when I think about Naomi, she's much like T.E. Lawrence. Not a real significant person, but she had a vision. She had a vision, and she cast that vision on somebody that could do something about it, just like T.E. Lawrence cast that vision on the Sheik of Mecca. And Ruth, and she helped Ruth with the actions she needed to take to ask for redemption, and it happened. And Ruth made it possible, but Naomi's vision, Naomi's dream, is what put it into action. And so I put in there on your lesson sheet the great Proverbs 29:18, where there's no vision, the people perish. So back in chapter 1, Naomi had no vision. She felt like she was perishing. She was just surviving. She was just getting by. But by the time you get to chapter 3, she's developed a vision. She said, there's more to life than just getting by. There's more to life than just living day to day. There's more to life than just going paycheck to paycheck and just kind of living and dying. I'm going to have a vision. I'm going to do something with my life. I'm going to do something about my life. I learned this poem years ago. I put it on the top of your lesson sheet on the second page. 2 men looked through prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. 2 men in exactly the same circumstances, but they're choosing to look in different directions. One just looking down at the dirt, thinking, oh, poor, pitiful me. The other guy is looking at the stars, and he has a vision of what he can do when he gets out of there. So the question to us as we close the lesson is, am I a Naomi of chapter 1? Am I just getting by? Am I just surviving? Am I just kind of blaming God for everything that happens in my life? Or I'm the Naomi of chapter 3, where I see that there's hope, there's vision, and I can do something about my life. I can change my life. I don't have to stay where I am. Because with God's help, if I give my will to Him, He will order my steps, and He'll make something out of my life. Not necessarily for my pleasure, but He'll make something out of my life for His pleasure. And so if you turn that last Proverbs 29:18 around, where there's no vision, the people perish, turn it around 180 degrees. Where there is vision, people don't perish, people live. We want to live. We don't want to just stay on this earth and just kind of wither away and die. So let's be like the Naomi of chapter 3. Anyway, that's a lesson tonight. Next time in 2 weeks we'll do chapter 4. So appreciate you being here on this nice, cool evening.